Hello, my dear Horror Area 51 family. I hope all of you are definitely enjoying our scary story. I just have one request from you, that if you are watching this video and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please quickly press the subscribe button. It motivates us to bring more such content for you. So, let's embark on this journey of a terrifying story. There is a story they tell in rural New York, whispered around campfires and spoken in hushed tones whenever a backyard faces the forest. It starts with shadows that don't belong, shadows of men who are always out there, just past the tree line, still as carved statues, waiting for someone to look too long. By the time someone finally notices them night after night, it's already too late. This is the story of the Carter family, who learned too late that sometimes it isn't a matter of what is watching you, but who. Dan and Cheryl Carter thought the old house in upstate New York was their dream. After years of cramped apartment living in Queens, they bought an 1890s farmhouse with an acre of land and a backyard that stretched into the woods. Their teenage daughter, Lily, hated the idea at first. She missed the noise of the city, the convenience of fast food a block away, and her group of friends. But the further she walked into the sprawling yard, the more the silence of the place settled into her, heavy and undeniable. "It's peaceful, right?" Cheryl said that first afternoon, balancing a box on her hip. "Peaceful is another word for boring," Lily muttered, though her eyes were already drifting toward the back fence where the trees stood dense and dark. Neighbors were few and far between in Rockwood Hollow, and the nearest town was a 10-minute drive. Still, the Carters felt like this would be their chance for a new life. Space, safety, quiet away from city chaos. But on the very first night, the men appeared. Dan woke to the sound of barking. Their Labrador, Rusty, wasn't the type to make a fuss. He was mellow, more apt to sleep at Cheryl's feet than guard anything. Yet there he was, snarling toward the backyard from the sliding glass door. The porch light flickered strangely as Dan moved closer. At first, he thought it was just trees swaying, but once his eyes adjusted, he froze. There, beyond the fence line, stood 3 men. They weren't moving. Hands at their sides, no flashlights, no phones, no hats, just standing. "Hey!" Dan shouted, trying to sound commanding. "This is private property." They didn't shift. They didn't even flinch. It was as if they weren't really breathing. Dan backed away, locking the door, trying not to wake Cheryl. He told himself it had to be local kids messing around, maybe hunters passing through. But as he turned off the lamp, he saw their figures still rooted at the tree line, not taking a step closer, just watching. In the morning, Dan didn't mention anything, but Lily did. She sat at the breakfast table, poking at her cereal. "There were people outside last night." Dan froze. "What makes you say that?" "I saw them," she said slowly. 3 guys, standing in the yard." Cheryl looked up sharply. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." Dan shot his daughter a glance, searching for signs she might have just been spooked, but then Lily added something that sunk into him cold. They weren't moving. I mean, at all. Just waiting. For the rest of the day, Dan pretended to shrug it off. He spent hours working on unpacking boxes, mowing the yard, but every time he glanced toward the woods, he swore he could feel them again, just past the tree line. At the grocery store, Cheryl struck up a conversation with the cashier, a woman named Eileen who'd lived in Rockwood Hollow all her life. "How long have you lived here?" Cheryl asked cheerfully. "All my life. Family before me, too." "That's wonderful," Cheryl smiled. "We're settling in, though we had a strange thing last night. Some people in our yard. Maybe local kids?" Eileen's face stiffened. She glanced around, lowered her voice. "They looked like men." "Yes," Cheryl said cautiously. The cashier leaned closer. "Don't look at them too long. Don't let your husband go out there." The cashier rang up the groceries, refusing to say another word on it. Cheryl went home uneasy. When she told Dan, he tried to laugh it off. "She's just trying to spook the new family. You know how these small towns love their ghost stories." But Cheryl couldn't shake the way Eileen's hand trembled when she took the cash.
Every night after, the pattern repeated. The men always came after sunset, always 3 of them, standing, watching. Dan started keeping track. On Monday, they were by the old oak tree. On Tuesday, closer to the stone well behind the fence. On Wednesday, at the very corner of the yard. But they never entered. They never crossed the fence. Rusty barked every night. Lily stopped sitting near the sliding door because she swore she heard whispers in the glass, tiny voices that weren't quite male and weren't quite human. "They're trying to talk to us," she said. One night, Dan decided enough was enough. He grabbed his phone and snapped pictures through the window. Except when he looked down, the photos were empty. Not a blurry shadow, not static, just nothing. No men, no trees disturbed, as though his camera refused to recognize what his eyes had plainly seen. Cheryl begged him to stop staring out there so much. "You're feeding it," she said in desperation that night. "I don't know what they are, but you're inviting it." The following Friday, Dan made a mistake. He stepped into the backyard. At first, nothing changed. The men stood silent at their usual post. But when Dan crossed toward the fence, the middle one moved. Only slightly. His head tilted, like a doll forced by a child's hand. The others shifted in unison. Dan stumbled back, his chest pounding as their faces finally caught a streak of moonlight. What shocked him most wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. No eyes. No mouths. Just smooth, pale skin. Mask-like. He bolted back into the house and locked the door. "Don't go out there again," Lily whispered from the stairs. "If you see their faces, they see yours too." Dan tried asking around in town. Mostly people pretended not to hear his questions, but one older man at the hardware store muttered low, "You bought the Carter place? Jesus Christ, they should have torn that house down." "What do you mean?" Dan demanded. The man met his gaze just long enough to say, "Treeline men don't forget. Anyone who lives back there, they watch. They don't do nothing. Unless you look too long. That's when they come." On the 10th night, Lily woke screaming. "They're inside! They're inside!" she shrieked, as Dan and Cheryl rushed to her room. Her window was wide open, curtains billowing, scratch marks along the sill. But no men. They spent the night huddled in the living room with every light on. Rusty paced madly, barking at corners no one could see. Dan kept the shotgun by his side, even though deep down he knew it wouldn't matter. By the second week, the men didn't need to stay behind the fence. One by one, they drew closer. First, on the grass near the fire pit. The next night, on the porch itself. Always at night. Always silent. Cheryl broke down crying. "We have to leave, Dan." But when they tried, the car refused to start. The engine turned over, sputtering, but never caught. Dan checked every fuse, every line. Perfect condition. It was Lily who said the words no one wanted to. "They're not letting us leave." Nights turned into endless terror. Sleep was impossible. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across walls. Rusty stopped barking altogether and simply lay frozen, eyes following things no human could see. Lily drew pictures constantly. filling notebooks with sketches of eyeless faces. They don't look like men. They just wear the shape of men. On the 21st night in Rockwood Hollow, it happened. Dan opened his eyes again. The living room was empty. The TV glowed static gray. The lights flickered faintly overhead. Cheryl was on the couch, head in her hands, trembling like she'd just woken from a nightmare. The realtor put the Carter house up for sale 3 months later. Priced cheap, newly renovated, perfect for families searching for peace and quiet in upstate New York. Prospective buyers sometimes comment on the yard. "It's got such a gorgeous view, but those woods are a little creepy?" The realtor only smiles. If anyone looks too long toward the tree line, she steers the conversation quickly elsewhere. Because sometimes, even now, when the shadows stretch tall across the grass, 3 men are standing there, still as statues, and they are waiting.
"Where's Lily?" Dan croaked. They searched the entire house, calling her name until dawn bled through the windows. No trace. Her room was exactly as she'd left it, sketchbook sprawled open, lamp still glowing. Only the window was unlatched, curtain whispering with the morning breeze. "She wouldn't run," Cheryl whispered. "She wouldn't." Dan checked the yard. Nothing. Just dew, grass, and the faintest impression of footprints too long and too narrow to belong to human beings. By daylight, the men vanished as though the earth swallowed them in the sunrise. Dan didn't waste time. He drove into Rockwood Hollow, demanding the sheriff come. Sheriff Ed Forsyth was a heavy-set man with a mustache as tired as his eyes. He listened, tapping his fingers against the desk. "Missing girl, huh?" Forsyth said evenly. "We'll file the report." "That's it?" Dan snapped. "There were men in my house last night. 3 of them. I saw their faces." Forsyth's eyes narrowed slightly at those words, and for the first time, his voice dipped in a way Dan didn't like. "You looked too long, didn't you?" Dan froze. "What the hell does that mean?" But Forsyth didn't answer. He just stood, put on his hat, and muttered, "Best you head home. Don't linger outside after dark." It wasn't a warning, it was a sentence. That afternoon, Cheryl drove into the local library while Dan restlessly paced the backyard. The Rockwood Historical Archives were small, but dusty files told grim stories. Newspaper clippings from the 1930s and 40s contained headlines like, "Family vanishes from farmhouse near tree line. Authorities baffled. Local sheriff declares wooded acre uninhabitable. Witness reports faceless men before tragedy." Families would move in, last weeks or months, then disappear entirely. Houses were resold. Records grew sparse as locals stopped talking. What chilled Cheryl most was a pattern in the descriptions. Always 3 men, always by the tree line, and once someone inside claimed to see their faces, the family didn't last more than a month. It had been 21 days now since they moved in. Back home, Dan rifled through Lily's notebooks, desperate for clues. At first, the drawings were just stick-like figures in charcoal, faceless men beside the trees. But as pages turned, the drawings grew more precise, more accurate. By the final entries, Lily had captured the men in unsettling detail. Long limbs, smooth heads, and bodies slightly too tall for human anatomy. The last page stopped Dan's breath. It wasn't a picture of the men. It was a picture of him, scribbled in frantic strokes, standing between them in the backyard. That night, no men appeared at first. For hours, the backyard lay still, silent beneath the stars. Then Dan heard knocking. Not at the door, not at the glass. From underground. It reverberated through the floorboards, steady as a heartbeat.
Cheryl covered her ears, rocking in terror. Dan gripped the shotgun, though he knew the futility. Rusty whined, scratching at the cellar door. The smell of earth and damp mold seeped up, unnatural in its intensity. Dan whispered, "They're under the house." And slowly, the knocking stopped. The next morning, Dan staggered to the hardware store again, demanding answers from the old man who had hinted at the Hollow's curse. The man wouldn't meet his eyes. They're not men. Never were. The Hollow claimed them generations ago. Now they wear faces no one should see. "How do we get her back?" Dan shouted. "You don't," the man rasped. "Once they take you, there's no return. The only thing you can do is not look long enough to join them." But it was too late. Dan already had. That evening, Dan caught himself in the bathroom mirror and faltered. His reflection's eyes were gone. Smooth skin stretched across where sockets should be. He blinked hard, and the vision snapped back. But when he touched his face, he swore the skin beneath his fingertip pulsed, thin and hollow. Cheryl gasped when she saw him. "It's starting." By the 25th night, the Carters' house no longer felt like theirs. Doors opened on their own. Windows kept unlocking. At sunset, the backyard glowed in that unnatural white haze again. This time, all three figures stood in the yard, closer than they'd ever dared. Behind them, between the trees, Dan saw her. Lily, standing too still, her head tilted like theirs. "Daddy," she whispered, except her mouth never moved. The sound burned directly into his head. Cheryl clutched him, begging him not to go outside, but Dan was already stepping toward the sliding door. The men did not move as he opened the door. The air was colder than the night should have been, sharp as knives. His breath fogged in quick bursts. Dan crossed into the yard, feet heavy, like the grass was thick mud dragging him down. Each step he took, their heads twitched slightly. Then Lily extended her hand, and for the first time, the middle figure raised its arm, jointless, wrong-shaped, a gesture both invitation and command. Dan froze. Behind him, he heard Cheryl scream. Ahead of him, the hollow woods opened pale and endless. And Dan Carter finally understood. The backyard wasn't just land. It was a doorway. Dan didn't remember making the choice. One moment he stood paralyzed on the porch, the next his bare feet sank into the cold grass as he stepped toward Lily and the faceless watchers. The woods seemed to part for him, opening into a corridor of trees. Shadows rippled as though the branches themselves leaned in, hungry to swallow him whole. Behind him, Cheryl sobbed, "Dan, don't, please." But her voice grew weaker, as if distance stretched unnaturally, even though he had only taken a few steps. The men turned in unison and began to walk. Not fast, not even steadily, but in stuttering, jagged motions, like marionettes tugged by broken strings. Lily followed, her hand drifting just out of reach. Dan stumbled after them into the tree line. And then, the backyard disappeared. The woods were no longer the woods. The air smelled of rot and iron, yet no wind stirred. Trees twisted upward unnaturally tall, their bark pale as bone, so tightly packed they formed walls closing in. The ground wasn't quite soil anymore. It shifted beneath Dan's steps like breathing flesh, soft and damp with each footfall. The men walked soundlessly. Only Lily's soft voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Dan staggered. "Lily, baby girl, we're leaving, together." But she didn't respond. Her body moved like theirs, jerky, unnatural, though her eyes, when they met his, still glistened with humanity. The men led him deeper until an opening appeared. A hollow clearing stretched wide,
bathed in that pale white light with no clear source. And they were not alone. Dozens more figures stood frozen at the edges, faceless, eyeless, mouths sealed beneath smooth skin. They tilted their heads in unison when Dan entered, their movement echoing like cracking bone. Some were dressed in clothes decades old, faded work boots, polyester dresses, overalls dirt-stained from generations past. Dan realized with icy clarity, these weren't just men. They were everyone who had ever lived in the farmhouse before them. Families swallowed whole by the hollow. A low hum began, vibrating under Dan's ribs. It wasn't sound, it was pressure, words searing directly into his head. Dan clutched his head. "I don't want this, I just want my daughter." The faceless crowd tilted again. Slowly, horribly, their skin began to ripple. Thin slits tore across where mouths should have been, opening not with blood, but with a shadowy void, black, deeper than night. From them poured a single unified whisper, "She is already ours." Lily's body twitched as she stepped close. Her small hand brushed Dan's sleeve. Her eyes were wide, wet with tears, but her voice was no longer truly her own. They said, "You can take someone's place, Daddy." Dan's blood froze. What? The hollow always needs three. 3 watchers at the edge. If you take her place, I'll be free. Behind the crowd, figures twitched eagerly, eager to absorb another. The men in the clearing extended their arms slowly, as though inviting Dan into their ranks. It was the choice, the only one. Him or Lily.
Before he could decide, a scream tore across the grove. Cheryl burst from the woods with Rusty at her side, clutching a rusty axe she must have grabbed from the shed. Her face was pale with fury and terror. "You're not taking them!" she shouted, swinging wildly at the faceless crowd. The axe sliced through one figure, but instead of falling, it crumbled like ash and reformed instantly. Rusty lunged, biting into another, but his teeth sank through mist, his body thrown back like a rag doll. Still, the distraction broke whatever trance Dan was under. Lily collapsed against him, shivering. For a split second, she felt solid, real. The faceless turned their gaze to Cheryl in perfect, terrible unison. Dan gripped Lily tight and shouted to his wife, "Run!" Cheryl swung again, but the axe grew heavier, dragging as though unseen hands pulled it down. She dropped it, her own hands clawing at her throat, gasping like the air had turned to stone. Dan stumbled toward her, clutching Lily with one arm. With each step, the ground pulled at his ankles, sucking, resisting. "Choose," the void whispered again. "3 must stay." Dan realized then, the hollow wasn't asking. It had rules, ancient and fixed. 3 would remain, always 3. He could stay, Cheryl could stay, or Lily could stay. But someone would be claimed. Dan thought of all the families before theirs, trapped in eternal silence, sacrificed to the hollow until they were nothing but watchers themselves. He felt his reflection in his mind again, eyeless, hollow, so close already. Maybe this was inevitable. But he also thought of Lily's laugh, the way she begged for pizza on weekends, the sketches she'd made of imaginary worlds. She didn't deserve this. Dan pressed his lips to Lily's hair and whispered, "You go. You run with Mom." Her sob broke his heart. "Daddy, no!" But it was too late. Dan stepped into the clearing. The figures shuddered, heads tilting welcomingly. The middle watcher extended its arm further. Dan grasped it, his skin burning cold instantly. His body writhed as his reflection solidified before him. His own form stretching tall, his face smoothing into pale blankness. His voice died in his throat. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was Cheryl dragging Lily from the edge of the hollow, both screaming his name as the woods swallowed them back into the real world. And then there were three. Always three. The world snapped back with a sickening lurch. Cheryl and Lily stumbled into their backyard, the farmhouse looming against the breaking dawn. The tree line was still, ordinary again, birds chirping softly, a breeze rustling leaves. But Dan was gone. Cheryl collapsed to her knees, clutching Lily. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of what she had seen threatened to crush her. Rusty lay beside them, bloodied but alive, whining low and broken. For the first time since moving here, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like an empty headstone. By mid-morning, Sheriff Forsyth arrived. Not because Cheryl had called, her phone line still didn't work, but because he was already on the road. He stood at the porch, hat low, listening quietly as Cheryl told him, "They took my husband." The sheriff only sighed. "I thought that might happen." "You should count yourself lucky, Mrs. Carter. Most don't make it back at all." Lily cried out, furious, "He saved us! Aren't you going to do something?" Forsyth shook his head, voice burdened with defeat. "You don't understand. Some men don't come back because they're not supposed to. That hollow's been here since before any town stood, before Rockwood Hollow had a name. All we can do is keep our heads down, pretend nothing's wrong. That's the deal." Cheryl's blood ran cold. The deal? The sheriff tilted his hat lower, as though ashamed. "Why do you think this town still stands while families are swallowed every few years? Because the hollow is owed, and the town lets it collect." That night, Lily refused to sleep. She sat by the glass door, staring towards the tree line. Cheryl begged her to stay away, to pack what little they had left and try to flee at first light. But Lily shook her head. "He's not gone." Her voice was steady, far older than her years. "I saw him. I felt him. He's still in there, Mom. He chose to stay, but he's fighting it. If he's still in there, then we can bring him back." Cheryl wanted to believe, but when she looked at the tree line, all she saw was silence, thick, waiting silence.
The next day, Lily went back into town on her own. Cheryl chased after her, but found her in the back of the library speaking with an elderly woman, hunched and frail, with piercing blue eyes. "I know who you are," the woman croaked the moment she saw Cheryl. "You're from the farmhouse." The woman's name was Agnes Wilmer. She spoke little at first, but when Lily begged for answers about her father, Agnes leaned forward with terrible clarity. "The hollow is not just a place. It's a hunger. It takes the living, the grieving, and the lost. But I know something the sheriff won't say. The hollow keeps pieces." "Pieces?" Cheryl asked. Agnes nodded. "A soul isn't swallowed whole. Fragments linger like light cotton glass. That's why they always look like men, but never are. They're echoes of everyone who's been taken. Which means if your husband gave himself for you, part of him is still fighting." Lily's eyes blazed with determination. "Then show me how to bring him back." Agnes hesitated, then pulled a journal from her worn bag, leather-bound, scratched, smelling of smoke and earth. Inside were drawings eerily similar to Lily's sketches, faceless watchers, the hollow glowing white,
family standing at its edge. "There's only one way," she said, "a calling ritual. If you enter the hollow at the right threshold of night, when the veils are thin, you can pull someone's spirit back. But it comes with a cost." "What cost?" Cheryl broke. Agnes's gaze hardened. "One watcher must take another's place. The hollow must have 3, always 3. Lily didn't hesitate. "I'll go instead of Dad." Cheryl grabbed her, furious. "Over my dead body!" But Agnes only whispered, "You may not get a choice." That night, as the moon rose fat and silver, Cheryl and Lily stood at the backyard's edge with Agnes leading them. Rusty trembled but refused to leave their side. Agnes knelt, spreading salt, muttering in a language Cheryl didn't know. She handed Lily a chipped mirror, instructing her, "If you see him, hold it firm. His reflection will tell you if his spirit is still yours." The woods grew quieter than death. The unnatural pale glow seeped back into the yard, and then they appeared. 3 men. The middle one tilted its head, and for the briefest moment, its shape spasmed, revealing eyes, Dan's eyes, before sealing smooth once more. Lily sobbed, "It's him! I knew it!" The watches stepped closer. Agnes's voice grew louder as she chanted, the salt circle trembling under an unseen push. The watchers did not like this. They began to twitch erratically, bodies jerking in violent spasms. A shrill hum filled the night, shaking the windows of the farmhouse. Rusty howled, pawing at Lily protectively. Cheryl held her daughter, fighting to keep her in the circle. The mirror in Lily's hands flashed, not with light, but with Dan's reflection, his face desperate, pleading, alive in a way she hadn't seen since before the hollow took him. "Dad, I'm coming to get you!" And Lily stepped toward the tree line. The salt circle split open as Lily stepped out, the mirror trembling in her hands. The glowing tree line pulled her forward, as though the world itself leaned toward her. Dan's reflection was clear now, his eyes frantic, his mouth forming words she couldn't hear but could somehow feel. "Don't!" But Lily's heart drowned out the warning. She rushed in, desperate to reach him. Cheryl tried to follow, but an invisible wall slammed her back. Only Lily was being pulled through. Agnes croaked from the porch. The hollow's chosen its bargain. No going back unless she pulls him free. Inside the hollow, Lily faced the circle of faceless figures. The 3 watchers stood before her, jerking their heads slowly side to side. The middle one glitched, ripping back Dan's eyes, Dan's shoulders, Dan's familiar shape for seconds at a time, before smoothing into blankness again. "Daddy," Lily whispered, raising the mirror. "Look, it's you! You're still here!" The watchers tilted, and the crowd began to whisper in unison, the sound like wind tearing through dead leaves. 3 remain, always 3. The ground shook. Maggie's words echoed in Lily's mind. To take him back, one must stay. Dan stepped forward, trembling, half a man and half a shadow. He reached for her, eyes shining. "Don't do it, Lily," he rasped. His voice was weak, broken. "Don't take my place. Let me go." Tears blurred her vision, but she held his hand tight. "No, you gave everything for us. Now it's my turn. You deserve to live. You deserve to come back." But Dan shook his head violently. His facelessness flickered in and out, his voice echoing inside her skull now. "If you stay, it'll eat you. You'll forget me. You'll forget Mom. You'll forget yourself. Please, live your life. Don't let this thing take both of us." For a moment she hesitated, and then she made the choice. Lily slammed the mirror against the ground. It shattered in an explosion of unnatural white light. The watchers writhed, screeching silently, their bodies jerking as cracks split across their pale surfaces. Dan's body broke free, ripped violently from the middle watcher, collapsing into the dirt beside her, bleeding, coughing, alive. But the hollow screamed. It had lost its balance. 2 remained. And 1 more was needed. Before Dan could grab her, pale hands erupted from the ground, seizing Lily's ankles. She was pulled down with terrifying speed, swallowed whole as the earth sealed itself shut. Dan shouted her name until his throat tore, clawing at the dirt. But she was gone. The hollow had made its bargain. There would always be 3. Cheryl saw it from the yard. Dan stumbling back through the tree line, his clothes dark with blood and earth, gasping her name. She rushed to him, holding him upright as tears poured down her face. "Where's Lily?" Dan shook his head, broken. "She saved me. She took my place." Her scream echoed through the still night, carrying across the empty town. From the edge of the tree line, the glow sputtered and dimmed. Now 3 figures stood there again, 1 taller, 1 broader, and 1 smaller than the rest. The faint outline of a girl, head tilted, watching. The Carters left Rockwood Hollow the next morning, abandoning the farmhouse, its doors still swinging open, the grass still damp from the pale light of the hollow. Dan never spoke much after that. Some nights he'd wake up screaming, swearing he could hear his daughter's voice calling through the windows. Cheryl never stepped near a patch of woods again. The house lies empty now, waiting for a new family. Realtors still call it quaint and charming, with its wide backyard. The neighbors know better, because when the wind is still and the night is cold, there are always 3 silhouettes at the tree line. And now, one of them is a little girl.